Yeah, I mean, I complained. I'm gonna make sure that something happens about it. But that's outrageous. I want my fees back if I can't go warm in the damn house. Okay, so I feel like I've been up and down the stairs about 82 times now.
So you're warm, so you're warm.
Yeah, well, actually, that was kind of good. It's better than sitting in here and freezing. So we won't prolong the agony. We'll end a bit shorter than we might otherwise. What I want to do is pick up on two central themes and then set us up for discussing the rhetoric part of the end. So here's our familiar, you recognize it instantly, right? That's our motivational stuff.
Looks like it.
That's the canonical shape of one. Don't draw it any other way. And here's an exciting fact about it that's very easily overlooked by discussions of various kinds. So the first two facts are, one is two questions about it. One is, given my motivational set, what should I do? And that's the kind of action-related, practical part, which often moves in. And so there's one, what should I do? I do, and that directs me to look into my motivational set. And the other one is, who should I be?
You've been there.
I've said this already,
Yeah.
so I'll practice. Who should I be? And that's directed at the motivational set and asks me how I should structure it. And that one comes up very quickly when we think about the motivational sets of immature agents, like children, where we're thinking about what should we put in their what should we get them to put in their motivational set? How should we get them to sculpt it? In both cases, we might have our idea, or eye, on happiness. But notice that it's quite different how we place our eye. So in this case, what should I do? I may be just looking directly and saying, what would make me happy in these circumstances? In this case, I'm not asking that. I'm asking, what things should I put in here that over time will result in my having a good and happy life? So this is not about what am I going to do now. It's about what in the long term will it be useful for me to have in my motive. Very important. Ethics is almost entirely, in my view, about sculpting your motivational sets, and very little about the next part, which once the motivational sets are in place, what you do with them just falls out from them. That's the kind of virtue ethics response, but you can actually track it back with any reasonable version of either Kant or utilitarianism. You're actually going to end up back here anyway. So you can just think about act utilitarianism is impossible as practical ethics. What? Well, look, you collapse under the weight of doing the calculation of which act in these circumstances will maximize the utility of who exactly, when exactly. Forget it. Right? So you're going to have to think about kind of fast and dirty, so this is what Bob Adams calls it, character utilitarianism. You're going to be thinking, what would a utilitarian put in his motivational set? And Kant has got very similar, so he's going to look at his motivational set with an eye on the categorical imperative. He's going to say, what should I include in it that passes the categorical imperative test? Right? But then he's going to think about, right, well, what would I have to do to get things into my motivational set that pass the test? And that's going to be about sculpting it. So he's always thinking, you should only put a motivation, you should only put a maxim, as he calls it, in your motivational set. If you will, let it be in everybody else's motivational set. Well, which ones are those? And how would you get them all in there? Well, that's a very complicated question. But you see the comeback to this. That's one question. And again, that's often overlooked, it seems to me. So now then that's the A issue. And then there's another, which Plato brings both of these to the fore, but the B issue is almost as interesting as the A issue. And the B issue is this, that when I look at what's in my motivational set, I'm going to see that it's got many of my motives, in fact a large number of them, are going to turn out to have a kind of future orientation. Well, it's easy to miss. So one thing I can be thinking about is, how do I affect the agents there are now? But a different one, and that can seem like, well, that's about altruism and issues like that, is a different one, which is, even if I pick one of my own sort of egoistic projects, does it presuppose that there will be other agents, or that there are or will be other agents? So consider the following. So maybe it's a completely egoistic project of mine. That is, it's all me desires. I'm just satisfying myself. What am I doing? Well, I'm writing a symphony. I'm composing a book, or writing a book. I'm painting a painting. I'm making a film. And it's all about me. Right? And so I can look at that and think, right? I might even say things like, it's good to be this selfish when you're doing something this important, right? And then I think, yeah, but wait, there's something else, though. I need there to be an audience. I need there to be viewers. And moreover, so to speak, how long do I need them to be around for? Well, suppose I've got my eyes set on eternity, right? I want to write, I want to write a symphony that will be played for as long as there is time and musicians. A great symphony. Then notice that I've got a kind of eternity-looking thing. My motives, even if I pick some, let me go to glorious technicolor here. So I'm going to pick some subset of motives, and these are going to be those sort of starred ones. And when I pull those out, they take me over here, and that is that they raise questions about the future and future agents. And notice that's quite different. It's not about, am I going to hurt or harm somebody now, or even, am I going to hurt or harm somebody in the future, which are when utilitarians raise this question, it's usually, since Derek Parfit, it's all been about the future generations question. I mean, what do I do about the welfare of, or the utility functions of future agents? And what about, what if what I do now creates different agents than there would be if I didn't? So they get caught up in that question, and they ignore, I think, a different question, which is, never mind their utility. Look at their role in my projects, right? Which is that I presuppose that they'll be there. And if they weren't, many of my projects would lose their point. I wouldn't do this, right, if there weren't going to be future people. So one of the things that when Diotima says that love is giving birth and beauty, and then she goes on that riff about, that the only way to do this is by begetting offspring, right? Offspring that might be biological offspring, but they might also be different kinds of offspring. She recognizes, or Plato recognizes, the importance of thinking about your motivational set as having this begetting function. You're motivated by your present motives to do the kinds of things that ensure the presence in the world of the agents you need to give your project's point. So that's a big, notice that's a huge appearance on the scene of just what you're involved with by having even egoistic projects of various sorts. So let's take a look at what of them are. So future agents, well, that's sort of roughly reproductive. So you're going to have some reproductive aims. Right? But then there's another, right? You're going to have social stability aims. So you're going to have, or broadly speaking, political.
And why is that? Well, because these future agents don't just, it's not enough that they exist. It's also got to be that they share enough of your values to be interested in the projects that you've done, right? So you've got your, even from very modest beginnings of me desires, not even altruistic ones. Inside those, when I unpack them, if I unpack them a la Diotima, I'll uncover two kinds of things. One, that there should be future beings, and that these future beings should be so socialized to share the values sufficiently that I have, that they care about and find value in the things that I'm committed to. So it's not enough that there be a bunch of little barbarians, right, who simply who look at my book and think, great, it'll burn, right? That's not what I want, right? I want them to actually read it. And I don't just want them to read it and not understand it. I want them to read it and understand it. I want them to read it and understand it and value it sufficiently to engage, a lot of stuff. And that's a big deal. I'm actually committed to the continuity of certain kinds of educational programs, of institutions, of the preservation of works of art and other things, a whole big load of things that get very, very complicated. So even when we start with a very narrow conception of what our goals are, as long as they're reasonably realistic, we recognize that they've got these two dimensions that are very easy to overlook. So this is like giving birth and beauty, all stuff, that's very important. That's kind of the more virtue ethics-y stuff. And when we put both of those in place, they have consequences. Let me become yet more technicolor and go to green. I should have really used green for this, so I could have used red for love, but I'm afraid that I wasn't that far thinking that far ahead. So it's green love we're going to have. So, what are the consequences of just this much for thinking about love? Well, last time we looked at one thing that I think is enormously important, and that is the psychology into which love is going to be absorbed. So it makes a great deal of difference that when we think about love, we think about it not just by cutting out a little bit and looking at a kind of stereotypical scene of love, but rather that we think of the way that love exists in a psychology that develops over time. So the first thought we have to ask about love is, about how it fits in A. Suppose we're trying to fit as we should, right? Who should I be? Well, one of the things we're going to do is think that, does love have a place in such a psychology? So suppose, for example, I'm a eudaemonist. I think this is the simplest one to take. So I'm trying to sculpt a motivational set that will promote my happiness and well-being over my lifetime, right? And I'm asking, should love be put in there? And what is love? Well, it's in part what gets sparked in the way that we know by the perception of beauty. But of course I could think that, one of the things that you should do when that happens is you should put out the fire quickly. Don't develop that, it's a disaster. And I think that some feminists have argued along a line like that romantic love is really crippling for women and you just need to get it out of your motivational set. So a different thought would be, well, maybe it sparks that way, but just what kind of a fire it lights depends on what kind of psychology it's going to be absorbed into. So Plato gives us three sort of options for looking at this motivational set, right? He's going to look at the appetitive, spirited, and the rational motivational sets. And as I said last time, each one of these is pretty good. They're not disasters, right? They can be pretty acceptable motivational sets. You could get a pretty good life out of having one of them. But for various reasons, one is better than the other two, right? Or the rational one is better. And we don't need to worry about that or even think that this is the right way to divide them up. There might be a billion ways to do it. I'm sure there are. So looking at that stuff, some of the stuff I put on the very first handout from Barrett Brogard about styles of loving and styles of psychology, about the risk averse, about the, right? You know, we could have a whole big typography of different psychologies within which love was going to be absorbed, and then what would be a good way, if there is one, to absorb it into that psychology. But I think it's better often, and one of the reasons that Greek philosophy was kind of a good place to start is because it's not as guarded as its later iterations, and because it's often simpler than its literary. You know, once things start getting messed up, it can be very hard to see why you ever got into this predicament. But if we just stick with three types and we sort of understand why there might be such three, then we can ask really good questions about how love will figure in these psychologies and how it should figure in them. And moreover, right, because we see how B enters the picture, we also want to see as how it fits in B. So one of the ways that comes out, of course, is the longevity of the agent, him or herself. So we develop over time, and our motivational sets undergo perturbations that are related to our agent. They are, you know, so that even if we do nothing, so to speak, our motivational set will age. A great place to look at an early version of this is in Aristotle's Rhetoric, where he considers old people, young people, and middle-aged people, and the characteristic differences in their psychological sense. So, you know, young people are typically less risk-averse than old people. You know, so it goes on to, you know, the young love laughter, he says the old really are curmudgeonly, and, you know, so it's a whole big load of things, but they really do have repercussions for how you think this thing, love, that you put in your motivational set, is going to change over time. So you're projecting a future for it when you start it. And that's typically what love encourages you to do anyway. Maybe it's a very short-term future, like can we find a place to make it, right? That could be just today, or it could be a long-term plan in which we're actually thinking, well, how can we live together, what kind of a house are we going to have, where are we going to, so can we afford to get married, should we have children, whole set of plans, how are our careers going to be meshed together. And these are all typically part of love stories that involve a changing picture. The other one we noticed is that limerence, if that's your sense of what you're into the love business for, if you're focused on limerence, then you're going to, and should be, focused on relatively short-term relations. Why? Well, because limerence is probably not going to last. It could, but it probably won't last more than about 3 years or so. And there's nothing, I don't see there's anything morally wrong or something like that with being a limerence seeker. Just as long as you know what you're doing and everybody else knows what you're doing too, so to speak, and you're not committing other crimes, there's nothing wrong with that. It's a style of loving. It might not be everybody's, but I don't think we should poo-poo it. And so, it's like, even one-night stand loving, right? The loving that just wants variety and excitement shouldn't be ruled out as somehow just, as long as you're not doing other reprehensible things in the course of getting what you want. So love goes in here and we have to think about its future. And that also involves a politics of love, right? Because what we're thinking is something like this. We're thinking about, in wanting a future of a certain sort, we're also wanting a world that allows for and makes safe and secure a future of that sort. So wars have a boring tendency to disrupt people's plans, and so do political upheavals, epidemics, earthquakes, fires, natural disasters, but all kinds of other things that are in the realm of the political, where we have an interest in preserving the kinds of political institutions that themselves foster and value the kinds of interpersonal relations we've got. So if we move in, suddenly find ourselves in a society that actually attacks those relations, then our willingness or ability to have them will go down. So to take some obvious examples, suppose we move, as we have done, so we move into a society in which the social surroundings don't support monogamous relations in the same way that they used to. So, for example, stigma attached to divorce, once significant, now non-existent. And what that means is, however, that a whole lot of forces that will hold you in a relationship disappear, and then it's harder to keep the relationship together under internal strains, right? So this is obvious. Different one, in the 50s and 60s, right, a single family, one male working, could have a good life, live in a nice house, have a car, send its 3 or 4 kids to school, have good health care. The financial pressure on the relationship was relatively low for middle-class people and so forth. Now it's much higher. Right? Education costs, healthcare costs, all those things have gone up. And even a couple where both are working, which of course puts added strain on the domestic sphere, that has changed. So all of these things, when we might think, well, in politics we're doing only one kind of thing, but actually it's pretty obvious when you think about it this way, that we all have good reason in wanting, having many, even the rather narrow aims that we might have in here, have already got unfouled political aims that we're just not making fully explicit to ourselves. So even very selfish people with very narrow aims, when they look at things over time, can be made to see that they've got commitments to fostering and encouraging certain kinds of societies and not others. Maybe the obvious one, let's suppose that you're an amasser of money. You're simply somebody who wants more and more of it. That's what you're doing, and you're unscrupulous about getting it. But you presuppose, for example, that the money will continue to have value in your where you have it. And if you happen to be living in Weimar, Germany, after the First World War, your money is going to suddenly become worthless. Not because anything you did, but because the surrounding circumstances have just devalued the Deutschmark to nothing. This happens to people with dreary and boring regularity, that they find that the cost of living has skyrocketed and their money has devalued, and that now it takes all their running just to stay where they are. Right? And that's dismal, but true. So even the most avaricious, narrow-minded Scrooge has reasons to want to preserve political stability and so on, even if it's only in the limited way that his money isn't going to devalue. Okay, so we look at how much we've been able to put on the table. That's what I really like about thinking this way, is that you can see that lots of things have far richer content than you might have been inclined to think out of time, especially when, with Diotima, you put in the factor or dimension of time, and you think about, not about making a time cut slice and then asking about loving back, which is what we often do, or a relatively short time period, like the period of falling in love and moving towards marriage, which was a staple of the 19th century novel, right? To thinking about what happens next. Not they all lived happily ever after. We know that's false, right? So we can't tell ourselves that love story over and over again. We kind of like it. Okay.
So the idea is, just to clarify, how it fits in B is not totally up to us. That's the gist.
So the thought is there are two, right? So when we think about how our love story fits into this, got two sets of dimensions. Well, first is how is the agent who's doing the loving going to persist through time and get involved in all these other kinds. There's also, of course, how things that the agent loves are going to persist and last through time. And that can be quite a broad spectrum. So the thought is that you also have to be thinking about that when you think about how would you fit love into the psychology of a being like this. Right? So we got three models. So I think this is a way to think about it. What happens in the symposium is you get distorted models, right, to start with. You get people who have absorbed love into their psychology in a way that Diotima is going to diagnose us not in a good way, right? And it's very inexplicit because, so to speak, all you see are the results of the distortion. You don't actually get that thematized, so to speak. And then Diotima tells you a story about what good loving is like that allows you to see elements of truth, but distortion in all the other stories. And what the Phaedrus adds is an explicit story about 3 psychological types, the kind of loving they do, what's the downside and upside of being loved in this way. So it puts on explicitly on the table the tripartite psychology that's kind of buried in the symposium. Yeah, so that's part of it. But then, of course, when we think about those, I mean, I'm going to take another step with it in a second, but when we think about the political dimension and about the way that institutions, and moreover, institutions that themselves shape motivational sense, play, right, the field for erotics, so to speak, grows exponentially. Okay, good? We all on clear? Okay, so now so last time, both last time and the time before, I took a few kind of leaps into the wild. And I want to, I want to take another leap into the wild, but now I think the roots of it have been set. So I'm going to approach it in a very strange sort of way at first. I'm going to ask, what is a utility function? And I'm going to say that Bentham told us a very simple story about utility functions. He said, well, look, utility is just pleasure minus pain. All pleasures and pains are on a par. Pushpin and poetry are the same. It's all just uniform coinage, and you're just looking to maximize the bottom line of that. Right? That's a very simple picture. Nobody since Bentham has liked it, pretty much, I think. But nonetheless, I think that they've all labored under the shadow of that. Even though, right, they've messed around in all kinds of ways. So Mill, influenced by Plato, tries to get you higher and lower pleasures, and worries about, as he rightly should, about incommensurabilities once you start having higher or lower ones, right? Are you going to get the sums to come out? Or are you going to... But I want to go back and I say, so what is a utility function? So here's one example, pleasure minus pain. That's one kind of utility function. And what does that tell me? Well, that tells me that beings that can experience pleasure and pain have utility functions. So now let's look into our own future. Right, so we're thinking about, and speaking this lingo, we're thinking about future beings and their utility functions. And we want to shape them in a certain way, or want to shape their motivational sets in a certain way, but tie in with our own projects and their significance, right? So we want to have appreciators for the projects that we have if they need appreciators. Do those future beings have to have utility functions of the pleasure-pain sort? Could there be other kinds of utility functions? So imagine this story, right? We're not, so this is what we were talking about last time. We're not the end of anything. Human beings are just, this is what Proust calls them, I think it's just race. They're just rough prototypes in the spiritual life. That's the way he puts it, right? They're not, they're just crude versions of angels. That's a kind of funny way to put it. That's right. They're not, there's nothing sacrosanct about biology. Nothing really even all that interesting about the wet work, right? Those sort of blood, guts stuff. So when somebody like Searle tries to tell you that, really look, because computers are little electronic things and we've got cells, that's really a very important difference for, their whole mentality and what we can think about them, whether we can attribute intentional states from them. There's a moment at which you can sort of think, really? How could that be true? How could blood be doing that? Man, that just seems really weird. I mean, I don't know about you, but if I went to the doctor and the doctor said, gee, it's a really interesting case. you don't have any of that wet work that the rest of us have got at all. You seem to be mostly circuits and stuff. Right? This is one thing for sure. I wouldn't think. I would say, well, there goes my ever having had any thoughts or anything. Right? No, I just think, hey, what a surprise. I'm kind of surprised when I go to the doctor and they tell me I've got wet work in here. I thought I was sort of homogeneous throughout. It would be, it's really disturbing to discover that you've got all this junk inside, most of which you really don't have any interest in having, except that it contributes to your welfare. And if you could do it simpler, it would be it's not like, I'm attached to my lungs as such. Right? If somebody said you can replace your lungs with the lung device or the non-lung thing, I think, fine, do whatever, as long as it keeps me going, what do I care? I don't know if you've ever seen this New Yorker cartoon, but I just love it. If you're like me, what you want your car to do is when you put the key in the thing and it turns, it starts and goes. You really don't care how it does that. I am indifferent to what goes on under the hood. I've, in fact, never really looked under the hood. I don't want to know. But anyway, there's this great New Yorker cartoon where a woman pulls into a garage and the mechanic opens the thing, and inside there are all these little furry creatures with teeth looking out, and the mechanic says, "There's your problem." It's great. I love it. That's my thought. So look, we're not really attached to the wet work, and we don't really have much of a sense that being biological is somehow just kind of radically different in kind from being very complex but electronic, non-biological. So if we were to start replacing, as we're already doing, little bits of ourselves with ionic parts, I don't think we would think that that was a disaster. And where I want to take you with that is to think that the future beings that we might be looking at might not be like us at all. They might not even be biological entities. So do I really care, for example, if my books are going to be read not by creatures who metabolize and have blood flow and stuff like that, but actually are being read by, robots who are into them? Gee, I don't really feel the strong initial thought, no, I want it to be people, right? That seems like a kind of speciesism, which is kind of weird. I find it hard to get my mind around it. Now, let's back up and ask about the utility functions of robots. Do we think that in order to have utility functions, they have to feel pleasure or pain? And, a lot depends on what you think pleasure and pain are. So let me give you a little riff on pleasure and pain. So I think that just as Franklin's thought about utility functions was dominated by those pleasure-pain idea, and his notion of pleasure and pain was dominated by a picture of pleasure and pain as sensations, right? That's where the whole thing started to go off into cuckoo land. Why? Well, here's my thought. So if we ask ourselves, what is a pleasure? Right? We might think, well, it's like, this little feeling. And I think, no, think about it differently. Think about its role. What does a pleasure do when you experience it? So let's keep it very simple first. Very simple somatic pleasures. Infants, newborns, little cats and dogs, they all have them. What's the characteristic feature? Well, a pleasure is one that when you get it, you do this. Right? You move into it. You want more of it, you like it. Right? And what's a pain? Natively, you back away from it. That's its role, right? A pain is something that gets you away, and a pleasure is something that gets you in, right? Now, some sensations do that, but once we get beyond a very simple level, to be asked, what are the sensations, the pleasurable sensations you get from playing golf? Where are they located? Those kinds of questions just seem to be stupid questions. Like, I have no idea. I could probably come up with some junk I could say, but I know that it's wrong. there's no sensations that are characteristic of these, right? And so the thought here, though, is there are things that when you experience them, make you want to experience them more. And there are things, right, like hooking the ball out of bounds over and over again, that make you want to experience them less. But it's not because they're associated with sensations that have those initial feels. It's that all by themselves, they've got the go for it shun. Now, no doubt we want to be able to tell a story of how you get from the simple to the complex. How do you get from liking mom to stroke you, to liking to please mom, to wanting to be someone who's pleased? We want to tell a developmental story about our pleasures too. And we need to tell one about our utility functions, about how they get sculpted over time. So utilitarianism fails, it seems to me, on two fronts. One, about how it conceives of utility functions, and then the other is about its failure to consider not how do you deal with already existing utility functions, but how do you produce utility functions. Notice that utilitarianism doesn't tell you anything directly about how to produce utility functions. It says you should maximize utility. But notice there are a number of different ways you could think that question applied. One is, given the utility functions that people actually have, how would you maximize them? And then a different one is, which utility functions should people have? People who yet don't have a utility function or have a very primitive one. How do you get them to have good ones? That Richard Valheim, who among his other strengths of philosophy was very influenced by Freud, Valheim calls that preliminary utilitarianism, and he says that utilitarians have to be committed, like Mill, to developing rich utility functions. Right? Why? Well, because a way to increase the amount of utility is not always to go to the existing utility functions and satisfy them. It's to build new utility functions, the satisfaction of which produces far more utility than satisfying the ones you've got. Okay, so notice how the two fit together, right? You've got how to sculpture utility functions, and then moreover you've got this notion that there's no reason at all to consider grown-up utility functions or future utility functions as tied to the sensations. So you can imagine computers or robots that when they do something, right, is not discussed at when they do something, I'll want to do it again. And when they do other things, I say want to, being an anthropomorphic. When they do it again. And when they do this, they don't do it again. So we might already begin to build into even very abstract kinds of machines that don't have sensations, notions of utility functions. Now, the reason I put all that in is that, when we read the literature on utilitarianism, we have an awful lot about cats and dogs, and how since they have pleasures and pains, should we be taking them into account? A lot of utilitarians have been led to be vegans and other things because they worry about the pleasures and pains of animals, and why are they so different from ours? Well, notice that if we extend it, there's no particular reason to think that the pleasure-pain sensation matrix is the one to always be looking at. Utility might have much larger dimensionality than that, of which that's only one aspect or version. Okay, so that's into the thought, which I think is the one I've been kind of playing around with, is, right, when we take that into account, what are we talking about when we talk about building a utility function that actually is eudaimonistic? If we think of that as maximizing utility, notice that we can think that's got a lot more room for development in it than we might have thought if we were sort of under the influence of somebody like Bentham. And we're thinking that, happiness always had to be about, eudaimonism always had to be about pleasure and pain. Maybe it doesn't have to be like that, in which case we have a very different picture of what we're projecting into the future, right? We don't even need sensory beings in that sense, or beings with web work to be our future. Anyway, and then love too would be reconceived, right? Now, so it's very easy, so here's what I'm getting at. It's very easy to mistake an instantiation, right, that is something that happens to be a particular instance. It's very easy to take what are inessential features of it as an instance and turn them into necessary features. So the obvious one, right, is where you think, you have to write the letter A this way until you discover that you can write it that way in a whole lot of other ways, right? It's not essential to A. In fact, it's a very interesting question of just what the essential features of a letter are. What is that guy's name? He's Norwegian. I don't like common with about 500,000 other people. I don't know Norwegian, so Herman Capellan. So Herman Capellan, you know who that guy is? Does that name ring any bells? He's a philosopher of language. He was at Oxford for quite a while, and now he's in Oslo. And he's one of the best-looking philosophers I've ever come across. He's a very attractive guy. But anyway, Herman Capellan's views, doctoral dissertation at Berkeley, was on what is a token of a type, and he used letters as an example. And it's extremely hard to answer. Just think about how we would say, what is it to inscribe the letter A somewhere, right? Or what about Morse code? Right? There's just a whole lot of stuff. And what do Morse code letters have in common with script or block capitals and so on? Okay, so that's a hard question. So here's the thought, is we take utility, because a very simple case of it happens to be somatic pleasures and pains, and we think, oh, it's the pleasure-pain part. That's the essence of utility function. But you can sort of see, just even if you just kind of dream along with the story I told you, that might be an inessential feature. The essential feature of utility might be something like this. The positive utility is something that makes you or that results in repetition, and negative utility is something that results in non-repetition. So if you take a very schematic, I'm not saying that's right, but a schematic picture would be like that. But pain is don't repeat it, pleasure is do repeat it. Pain, no, pleasure, yes. If we took that as our sort of broad speaking characteristic, then there's no reason in the world, as far as I can see, to think that pleasure-pain has to be part of the utility, or that it has to be part of happiness, that we could think of beings that were happy, but weren't sensate. And that would be already to take a big kind of stuff. So when we read Plato and Aristotle, and they tell us that it's the pleasures of the rational part that are the really good ones, they are not sensory. They're not. God can experience them. He doesn't have a body. And we might think, that's too far away. That's too far away. That can't be right. It bothers us, I think. But here's a way to kind of motivate the idea that we could extend the notion of utility, happiness, pleasure, pain even, to beings that don't have sensations. And that the integration into sort of richer conceptions of utility might be leaving the sensory behind. So think how much better it would be if we could just get rid of the damaging kind of corporal pain. Yeah?
So, when it comes to the pleasure, or the eudaimonia that comes from the rational contemplation, have we left all experience behind, or have we left bodily sensation? I know that's not a very
No, that's a good
distinction,
Yeah.
but I'm wondering.
Well, yeah. So I don't think there's any reason to think that we've left pleasure behind if we define pleasure in the way that I'm after, right? So that
Right.
one kind is the sensory, but that's only one kind. Yeah, look. I don't know what an experience is. Right? I don't know about you, but I hear a lot of stuff, especially in this building, because we've got people who are serious believers in transformative experiences, and maybe there are transformative experiences. I'm sure there are transformative events, stuff that happens to you, and you're transformed as a result of it. No question. Transformative experiences and the notion that you don't know what it's like to unless you've, and maybe you don't even know then, right? This bothers me a little bit. I mean, in the sense that I feel a bit at sea in it. I'm not sure what the criteria of success are. So, so the obvious one that Laurie has written about is, do you know what to expect when you're expecting? What is it going to be like to have a child? And you could think, well, I can tell you a lot about it. I mean, right, here's a big book about it. It'll tell you a lot about what it's going to be like. You're not going to get much sleep. It's a whole big load of stuff. And now if you sort of fine-tune in, but what is it going to be like for me? What are you fine-tuning in on? I mean, what would count as you now knowing what it would be like for you? And you can get, well, you know what it's like to have a first child, but do you know what it's like to have a second one? You know what it's like to have that child, but do you know what it would be like to have that one? You know what each one of those can be a skeptical question, right? You have no idea what it's like to have a boy just because you've had 6 girls, right? Or whatever it is, you pick your favorite one. And I think that some of what's going on does seem to me to make a lot of sense. So, for example, when Proust tells me something like this, that, every artist, great artist, shows us a world that we would never have had access to except for that art. So, you want to know what faces look to Rembrandt? Look at Rembrandt's paintings. You want to know read the book, listen to the music. That's it. And if you then say, yeah, but am I experiencing it the way they did, now it seems to me that it's not clear where you're going with that question. So what is it like for you, has legs, but where they walk you to, once we're outside certain kinds of constrained conditions, I'm not sure. Would a great artist so imagine 2 things the way I do. So there's X, I won't give her any name. X has never had a child. And she's not ever even wondered what it's like to have a child. She just gets pregnant and has a child. And if you say to her, what is it like to have a child? She says, oh, it's like, So she says, doesn't have much to say about being a mother. I imagine lots of people are like this, not just about being a mother, but about everything. Like, gee, I don't know. I don't know what it's like. I don't even know what you're asking me. So just don't have, that seems to be a perfectly, so the thought that merely having a child makes you suddenly articulate about what it's like, or gives you some access to some special source of, quality info about what it's like, just seems false to me. It all depends who's doing it. Whereas somebody who's never done it, though, is very articulate, very imaginative, very sympathetic, might have a lot more to say about what it's like, even though they've never done it. So there's a whole set of stuff in there. So I think that, so that's a long-winded answer to your question, but I think the thought is, I don't see any reason not to attribute experience to it. And, but notice that experience, this is my thought about it. I think the experience, the very notion of it, and the idea of qualia, or inner space, is supposed to make a big difference between us and zombies or us and some other kinds of things. I think, too, that labors under the pleasure-pain benthamite sort of thought. Yeah, you know, you start with one thought. These are qualia.
Right.
And then you think, so the defining feature of qualia should be extrapolated from those. And it's, look at those, look, it's color patch, man. That's the essential feature. You see? That's what it's got. It's got to be like that. And I think that's just like the pain case. I don't see why it has to be just like that in order to be a qualitative space. So I'm willing to push back on some of that stuff, though I know that I'm venturing into territory where I can hardly claim to speak with full expertise on. Anyway, that's my thought. So notice that on all of this, there's plenty of room for all of our emotional terms, right? Okay, so that's phase one. I'll take 20 minutes to go into phase two and then we'll stop. That seem fair? I want to talk about rhetoric. And to do that, I want to read you something. Do we need to take a break? So people need a bathroom break or anything? We can. We'll wait
go to the restroom.
Okay, well, we'll wait for you to come back.
Oh.
Anyone else need to go to the restroom? Anyone else want to? Rest time. Yeah. We're all going to go to the restroom. Yay. I don't know why it's called a restroom. That's a negative. It used to be that in women's rooms there were couches where you could go and lie down for a while. I don't see many of those anymore. Not that I go to women's restrooms very often, but I just know there are no couches in the restroom. I don't even have to go in there to know that there's no couches.